I want to teach you about 20 to 30 new words today, but instead of doing it in a list, I want to teach you these words in the context of reading an article. It's a bit of an experiment, so I want you to let me know how it goes, but Brightlink Prep picked out this article as containing dozens of GRE relevant words and just brilliant words and phrases to know for anyone wanting to master the English language. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it just like I would a reading comp question in the GRE or the GMAT, and I'm going to highlight any interesting words or phrases that you might not know and explain what it means not only in the context of this article, but in the broader context of how you'd use it in everyday English. I haven't read the article before, but as I say, it was picked out for the number of interesting words that it contains relevant for the GRE. Let's get straight into it. The title is The Butterfly Crusher. Michael Mock's interview with Scott Fitzgerald is one of the most famous hatchet jobs of all time. Do you know what a hatchet job is? It's where someone, usually a journalist, comes to bring down someone's character. So on the surface, it's just a friendly interview maybe, but actually the mission is to assassinate the person's character. That's called a hatchet job. This journalist wasn't interviewing the politician or the author, they were intending to bring them down. That's a hatchet job. So apparently this interview was a hatchet job. Or at least that's how I remembered it. And that's how Fitzgerald's biographers usually characterize it. I just went back and looked at some of them. I can't think of another interview of a literary figure that has featured so prominently in his own legend. You may know the word prominently means standing out. This story, this interview really stands out prominently in his own legend. It sticks out, it's prominent. And yet, on rereading the interview, I guess, it comes across as a more nuanced and sensitive portrait than I remember. Now, I must confess, it's actually my favourite word in the English language, nuanced. It means full of subtle details, not as obvious as it first appears, full of intricacy, complexity. It's a beautiful word. You can describe paintings as being nuanced, articles, interviews, as this person is, anything with more subtle detail and complexity than first meets the eye. That's nuanced. Something with nuance. Anyway, the person reread the interview and it came across as more nuanced, more subtle, more complicated and sensitive than he remembers. If indeed I ever actually read it, as opposed to reading about it. So did the person actually read the interview or did they just hear about it? Maybe the story is a bit more complicated. I don't know. Maybe the full frontal tabloid journalism of our era has blunted my own sensibility. It's a fairly complicated sentence. Let's unpack it. Tabloid journalism is a derogatory phrase meaning journalism that's looking for sensational headlines, not the real truth. We often call that, particularly in Britain, tabloid journalism. To blunt his sensibility, to blunt something is to take off the edge, so it's not as sharp as before. So maybe this person had a sensibility, a sensitivity to something, but being used to the tabloid journalism, the sensational headlines of the current era has lessened that sensibility, that sensitivity, has blunted it. As you can see, this is quite an intricate, complex article, and you don't have to understand every single bit of it. I just want you to learn as many new words and phrases as you can. Hopefully you're following along now. Mock, the interviewer, is remembered as one of the villains of the Fitzgerald story, one of history's cloddish butterfly crushers. As the word sounds, cloddish means a bit clumsy, foolish, clownish, a bit like a clown. That's how I remember it. This person is one of history's most clownish butterfly crushers. Now, I don't know the phrase butterfly crusher. That's a brand new one. But I'm guessing they're implying that Scott Fitzgerald was a sensitive person, like a butterfly, and this interviewer Mock crushed him. But we'll see. I don't know. And while it's true, this interview did tremendous, which means enormous damage to Fitzgerald's reputation. And there is a rumour that Fitzgerald tried to commit suicide, oh no, having seen the piece. It can also be read as the mass market version of his own crack-up essays. Just quickly, mass market means for the general public, not something refined, advanced for the elite, something commonplace. So it's a bit of an insult. It's something just mass market. But anyway, the author is saying that maybe Fitzgerald did something similar himself. He did these crack-up essays. Let's find out about them. They were vivid, which means detailed, bright, colourful, filling in of the portrait of mental and emotional collapse that he limned somewhat abstractedly in a series of autobiographical essays in Esquire that same year. So they're saying that Fitzgerald did the same thing himself. He almost brought himself down in a hatchet job. Again, a couple of more interesting words here. Limned, here, L-I-M-N-E-D, means outlined. The limb is the edge, so to limn something is to outline something. In a series of autobiographical essays. The word autobiographical, you may know, means about yourself, written about your own life and story. So Fitzgerald wrote a colourful, vivid outline of his mental and emotional collapse in a series of essays about himself in Esquire. In September 1936, when the interview was published, America was still recovering from the Great Depression, and the 1920s seemed to many like the gaudy binge that had produced the terrible morning after. So gaudy is showing off, ostentatious, over the top, and a binge is like when you drink too much, or do too many drugs, or eat too much food. So an over-the-top binge, probably of alcohol, had produced the terrible morning after. That's usually a hangover where you feel bad the next day. So it's a beautiful sentence describing the 1920s as an era where people went too far. They went on a gaudy, over-the-top binge, and they felt bad about it after. Economically here, in this case, it's a metaphor in the Great Depression when the economy crashed. Anyway, America was still recovering from this. Fitzgerald was the spokesman for the flamboyant generation that emerged after the First World War, a representative figure who not only chronicled the era, but who seemed to embody it. So he personally embodied that gaudy binge era. A couple more interesting words, as you might have noticed. Flamboyant is like attractive in a showy way, maybe wearing flashy clothes or saying bold statements. That person is dressing flamboyantly or speaking flamboyantly, a bit over the top. And the word chronicled means keeping a record of something in a journal or a newspaper, almost like diarizing something. So this individual, Fitzgerald, was a spokesman, a representative of this flamboyant, showy, over-the-top generation that emerged after the First World War. He was a representative figure who not only journaled, diarized, chronicled the era, but who personally embodied it, was an example of it. The quote begins, "For just a moment, before it was demonstrated that I was unable to play the role," he wrote in a collection of essays, My Lost City, "I was pushed into the position not only of spokesman for the time, but of the typical product of that same moment." So this is a complicated quote, but what he's saying is that he was pushed into the position of being a spokesperson for that era, and then later it was demonstrated that he was unable to play that role, and we don't know why yet. He and his beautiful wife Zelda provided at least one of the indelible images of that era when they jumped into the fountain of New York's Plaza Hotel in evening dress after a night on the town. Interesting word there, indelible. It means the memory won't be erased, like indelible ink. It won't go away, it'll stay forever. So apparently that's a famous image that will never be deleted from people's minds, him and his wife jumping into a fountain in evening dress. The Fitzgeralds were flaming youth, personified, embodied. And for a few years they seemed to relish, enjoy the role. During the years that Fitzgerald produced a significant body of work, including one of the greatest artifacts of the jazz age, The Great Gatsby. An artifact is like a relic, a product, a memento of that era. usually something symbolic or powerful. So for a few years, he relished that role and produced a significant body of work. That means multiple different projects and pieces of writing, for example, including The Great Gatsby, which is revered as an artifact of the Jazz Age. You may have heard of it. In retrospect, meaning looking back, Gatsby reads like an epitaph. An epitaph is what you write after someone's died. A memorial, an obituary. So Gatsby the book reads like an epitaph for that era. It is, among many other things, a prescient forecast of the end of the party. Prescient means having knowledge before, like predicting the end. So this is a prescient, smart, forward-thinking forecast of the end of the party. A subtle, nuanced critique of the glossy materialism of the era. Materialism is focusing on material goods like money, houses, wealth, property, instead of focusing on what matters. And apparently, The Great Gatsby is a subtle critique of that materialism, as well as being a forecast of how the party would come to an end in the Great Depression. Although Gatsby sold far fewer copies at the time than This Side of Paradise, the novel that gave birth to the flapper era and made its author a star. I actually studied The Great Gatsby at university, so this is relevant to me. If being a spokesman for a generation is a fleeting occupation, as in not lasting long, fleeting, being a symbol of an era is downright dangerous for anyone who has the bad luck to outlive it. So they're saying Fitzgerald outlived that era. In the next few years, the expatriate, someone who leaves their country, expatriate, Fitzgerald continued to publish stories about flappers and giddy undergraduates in the Saturday Evening Post, even as he struggled with alcohol and Zelda's increasingly unstable mental state. Oh dear. Travelling with Zelda in North Africa in 1930, he wrote about hearing a dull, distant crash which echoed to the farthest wastes of the desert. I think he's talking about the stock market crash, I'm not sure. When he returned to the States in 1931, he found a very different country from the one he had written about. By the time he published Tender is the Night in 1934, the privileged, that means lucky, usually rich, the privileged characters who populated his work were thoroughly out of fashion. The critic Philip Rave, in his negative review in the Daily Worker, told him off. You can't hide from a hurricane under a beach umbrella. The hurricane being the Depression and perhaps the will of the proletariat. Proletariat is a fancy term meaning the working class, the workers. So translating this critique, this scolding, this telling off, don't hide away from workers by writing about these rich people who are out of fashion these days after the crash. Anyway, I'm loving this article. It's really interesting. Let's keep going, see if we can learn any more new words. For those who didn't read the Daily Worker or the New York Times book review, Mock's interview provided a morally satisfying answer to the question, what happened to that guy who wrote about flappers and bathtub gin? His portrait of the artist as a broken down failure was almost as indelible, remember staining, lasting forever, as the earlier stereotype of the gin-swelling golden boy. A stereotype is like a prejudiced image of something. Like before you know someone, you have an image of what they're going to be like based on their background maybe, or their ethnicity, or their class. That's a stereotype. Having ceased to be a spokesman for his generation, Fitzgerald again became a symbol, this time of its flame out, its burnout, its failing, like the apocryphal stockbroker jumping out of the window. So you may know that it was quite famous, an image of the 1920s after the crash where stockbrokers, the traders in Wall Street, jumped out of the window committing suicide. And this word apocryphal means that wasn't actually quite true. It's kind of a made up story that didn't actually happen. It's apocryphal, it's a rumour, but it's not actually true. But the author is saying that Fitzgerald was a symbol of that flame out, a symbol of the failures of the previous era. Mock's portrait is unseemly, but it's not unfair. Unseemly means improper, impolite, undecorous, but it's not unfair. And one of the things that makes it so poignant, I love that word poignant, it means powerful, touching, affecting. One of the things that makes it so poignant is Fitzgerald's collaboration, his working together in his own depantsing. Depantsing isn't a common word, but here it's obviously like pulling down someone's trousers, like mockery. And apparently Fitzgerald collaborated. He went with it. What possessed him, you can't help wondering, to expose himself in this way, to expose his failings? It's as if he has determined to be a representative figure once again, even at the expense of humiliating himself, to reaffirm his significance as a generational totem. A totem is a symbol, a powerful symbol. Like the Native Americans have a totem pole, it's a powerful symbol that stands for something. So in this case, Fitzgerald is a generational totem. He is a symbol of a generation that failed. And he reaffirmed, he committed to his significance as a generational totem by portraying himself as an exemplary victim of its faults. Exemplary means like a perfect example. So Fitzgerald portrayed himself, painted himself as a perfect example of a victim of the faults of that era. What makes this document even more poignant, touching and powerful, almost unbearably so, too much so, you can't bear it, you can't stand it, is that Fitzgerald seems to have undervalued the literary achievement that would one day resurrect his reputation. So he didn't realise how much he'd achieved, even as it would always remain intertwined with the tragic myth of his life. So his literary achievements and reputation would remain intertwined, linked together with the tragic myth of his life. So he achieved amazing things as a writer, but his life was somewhat tragic, and he was a symbol, a generational totem of an era that was gaudy, optimistic, but then crashed in 1929 and then foretold the coming of the Great Depression. And that's the end of the article. Now, please do let me know in the comments how many new words you learnt, even if it was just one or if it was as many as 20 or 30. But more particularly, please let me know if you like this way of learning new words in the context of a larger article. And of course, it was also great practice for reading comp and critical reasoning. Really hope you enjoyed, and hopefully you learned something about a great author, Scott Fitzgerald. And if you like this kind of writing, of course, you can read his books like The Great Gatsby, which I read at university. Anyway, have a great day.